So thank you, Professor Thapar, for agreeing to do this conversation. But I'm going to actually begin on a rather dark note, which is well suited to the times that we're in. I think most of us in the room now would have read the Reuters report that's been picked up by pretty much all the newspapers and online news magazines. So the report by Reuters yesterday revealed that a 14-member committee formed some 6 months ago under the Ministry of Culture has been assigned the task of rewriting history. This is not rhetoric, it's the stated mandate. The panel is referred to in government documents as the Committee for, and here I quote it, the holistic study of origin and evolution of Indian culture since 12,000 years before present and its interface with other cultures of the world, close quotes. The minutes of their meeting that Reuters accessed in the meeting that was held in January set out the agenda, and it was, and I quote again, to use evidence such as archaeological finds and DNA to prove that today's Hindus are directly descended from the land's first inhabitants, many thousands of years ago, and make the case that ancient Hindu scriptures are fact and not myth, close quotes. And the report further states that they, and this is from one of the 14 members, they tried to get responses from as many as they could, was that they want ultimately to shape the national identity to match their religious views, that India is a nation of and for Hindus. In doing so, they're challenging a more multicultural narrative that modern day India is the tapestry born of migrations, invasions, and conversions. That view is rooted in demographic fact. Professor Thapar is no stranger, as she has had several brushes since the early 90s, really, with state attempts to distort her work, in fact, also to have her name on work that's not hers, or severely redacted work. So this recent news wouldn't have come as any surprise to you. But compared to earlier decades, the current moment seems particularly fraught. And indeed, as Professor Thapar cautions us in the most recent book, Indian Cultures as Heritage, Contemporary Past, that was published last month, and that's going to form the basis of this conversation. And I quote her here, the link between heritage and history needs careful attention, given that absurd fantasies are often woven about the past by people ranging from tourist guides to major politicians. Not to mention the deliberate distortions resorted to for ideological purposes in various ways, as, for example, sometime in school textbooks. The explanation of heritage is central to constructing a cultural memory. Therefore, its absence or its distortion can erase memory. And I close quotes. In the book, Professor Thapar has methodically interrogated the terms civilization, culture, and heritage. What constitutes these? What is the link between, and here this is in capital letters, culture with a capital C, heritage and history? Whose histories are being told? Who has the power to tell them? Who decides what the heritage of a country is? And how does this impact the idea of a national identity? What is highlighted and who is made invisible? My own background is in, well, art history or cultural studies, as I like to think of the expanded sort of realm of art history. And I studied at JNU, an institution that Professor Thapar joined in the foundational years.
But you didn't study your history
No, not
with us.
there. And not history at JNU at all, in fact. And I come into the conversation as an art historian, and I do have a few methodological quibbles, which I'll get into later, led by material culture. So I come in from that perspective. And I will, as I mentioned, talk about different methodologies. But the first question I have actually really stems from a word that we've heard very, very often across today, and that is the word heritage. We've heard it used on panels in different contexts and also in informal conversations over tea and lunch. And I'd like to begin with exactly this, the core concepts of the book that you lay out: civilization, culture, and heritage. What was interesting for me in this book that I'd urge all of you to get a copy of is that you speak of categories such as ecological heritage, tangible and intangible heritage that as art historians we may be familiar with. But you write also about migration, the impact of dominant groups of patrons and consumers on what is constituted as culture, of language, of intersections and absorptions to make a case for looking beyond the sort of hegemonic, commonly accepted narratives. And several of these lenses are so pertinent today, given the times that we're living in and given the sort of insecurities about all these categories. So could you talk a little bit about the changing formulation or the evolution of these concepts from the colonial beginnings to now?
Fine, yes, thank you very much. If I was to answer your question the way I'd like to at some length, we'd be here till midnight. But I'll try and be as brief as I can. For me, heritage is something that is selected. It is not something that is a package that is handed down generation after generation, unopened, assuming that it consists of particular facets of our lives. It is in fact something that is unpacked, repacked, repacked all the time. And there's a kind of assumption that this is something that goes back to the past. But by the time you've repacked it over a few generations, you begin to wonder what is there in it that goes back to the past. It may or it may not. So I'm unimpressed when people say, oh, this is our heritage. Because my next question is, what do you mean by this? And how far back are you going? And what do you understand of this heritage? Because your heritage obviously would change. And sometimes you have a heritage and you don't understand why you're regarding it as a heritage. Which brings me also to the question of what we miss out on very often when we talk about culture and heritage and so on, is that there is a point in time when an object or an idea is created. It is then used, it is discussed, or it's buried and put aside and not used, and then it's picked up again at some point. And it is again used and discussed, and sometimes it's then buried, or sometimes it continues. Let me, as a historian, give you an example of this. My most favorite object from the past, which is the pillar of Ashok Maurya at the fort at Allahabad. This is a pillar which originally contained his pillar edicts, put up in the 27th year of his reign, where he discusses Dhamma. He discusses his policy of Dhamma at great length, and also argues that I've done very well with it, and people have done very well with it. And in a sense, he's doing a kind of memo on how I have succeeded in converting people to this social ethic. All right. And he puts this near a monastery at Kaushambi, which is near Allahabad. And there the pillar stands, and after a while, presumably, perhaps its capital breaks off or something, but it's kind of standing there. Nobody refers to it again. And then comes the Gupta period, 600 years later, and someone, probably Chandragupta II, who's writing a prashasti, a eulogy, on the exploits of the great Samudragupta, who's always used to be described in the early days as the Napoleon of India, because he went around conquering all over the place. They put up this eulogy and they engrave it on the same pillar. And the question one asks is, were they able to still read the Ashokan inscription? Because the Ashokan inscription is all about you convert people not through conquest but through persuasion. I'm hoping that violence will not be used by my descendants, but if my grandsons and great-grandsons have to use violence, may they be merciful and light in their punishments. And then there's a lot about sects living together in harmony and that kind of thing. And then comes this Prashasti of Samudragupta, which says, I conquered, I destroyed, I uprooted all these particular people, and my conquests are what have made me great. I am the conqueror of the world, and there are all these people who are virtually at my feet. And you say, the tone is so different, the content is so different. wasn't there some sense of I'm contradicting this earlier statement? But in fact, there's no evidence of this. And the Samudra Gupta, the Gupta inscription, written in a very late form of Brahmi, unlike the Ashokan, which is the earliest form, cuts a little bit into the Ashokan inscription. Anyway, then you carry on, and in later periods, there are all kinds of people that visit the site, including the famous Raja Birbal, who was a minister of Akbar's, saying, I was here. It's exactly like today when you go to tourist places and you have, I was here, Ram Kumar, I was here, this kind of thing. That's the kind of graffiti which you have scattered all over the circumference of the pillar. And then comes one other inscription which actually cuts into the Ashokan inscription at the top, and it is Jahangir. Jahangir's inscription giving his genealogy going back to Timur and the Central Asians, and then coming down listing all the Mughal rulers, beautifully inscribed and lovely Nastaliq script in Persian. And you look at this object, or at least I look at this object, and I say, what did these people make of it? Did they regard it as heritage? Did Jahangir regard it as heritage? And if he did, which he obviously did, why? What were his reasons? He certainly couldn't read the earlier inscriptions because they were in a different script altogether, much, much later. Jahangir is 17th century, these earlier, the Samudra Gupta inscription is the 4th century, and that kind of thing. Then you begin to wonder that if they couldn't read it, they didn't know what was said earlier, what was it that made the Mughals, probably Jahangir, shift the pillar from this dilapidated Buddhist monastery into a very central position of his fort at Allahabad? Obviously there was something, he was respecting the pillar. He was giving it centrality. And then you have to ask the question of, how does he see it as heritage? Does he see it as not an object in itself, but an object signifying what I like to call historical consciousness? That this is an object that bestows legitimacy on the king and the ruler. It's written by somebody, we don't know who, because nobody knew what the first inscription was, who wrote it or what language it was, by another person who superimposes his inscription and makes it interlinear. And now I come along and I'm making the same claim. I am claiming the legitimacy of this historical consciousness and this pillar. Now, for me, that in a sense is a definition of heritage. That you have to define it. And if you say this is an object that I regard as heritage, you have to explain why. What is it in that object that you're deriving some kind of power, authority, connection, sensitivity, emotion, call it what you will.
Well, sticking with the same object, if we can call it that, we were speaking outside and I mentioned that I was going to ask you this. And you, in the book, you write about Walter Benjamin's idea that every object in a museum has an aura, and this aura needs to be communicated to visitors. Otherwise, what's the point, really? And I wanted to ask you about this and about the idea of objects with auras, but also how we regard objects as evidence, and what constitutes, because you refer to this often in your book, of historical sources, the veracity of the historical source. So what is a historical source in a history that's not led by objects? And can one make a case for, let's say, an object-led history, where it doesn't just serve as evidence, but the source?
Well, I would say that a lot of the early history that was written, early Indian history at least, or early histories anywhere in the 18th century, outside in Europe and the 19th century in India, they were objectless histories. I mean, the first history of British India written by James Mill in 1818 doesn't refer to objects at all. It is entirely ideas and theories about the narrative of the past and how the past has been constructed and so on. So it is possible to have a history without reference to objects, but of course later on people began to say that objects also are sources. Now, so what is a source? For a historian, a source is either an object or a text, preferably a text. We're very stuck on texts, I'm afraid. But I don't deny objects. I mean, you know, I started off with text, but I did bring objects in my first bit of research I did. It is something which gives you information about a period or about a person that you're researching already. So the information is there, and you say, all right, then there's let's take the reign of Harshavardhan in the 7th century AD, and there is a text, the Harsha-charita, which is a biography of Harshavardhan, which tells you where he was born, how he was born, what his parentage was, what his major achievements were, what the events in his life was, etc., etc. The usual biography. So that's a source. When you say I'm using this as evidence, then the reader should assume that you have compared it with other sources of the same period. Like, for example, in this case, where the Bhavan, who's written the Harsha-charita, is talking about life in the villages and the towns and so on. Have you compared it with the same period visitor from China, Yuan Xiang, who also describes towns and villages and so on? And how the two, how do they compare? And on the basis of this comparison, can you then draw out a statement which you say is evidence that people in the villages were not always well off, some of them were poor, and we have evidence of this from both these texts. Then you may come across an excavation of what was popularly called Harshkatila near Kurukshetra, which is seemingly Thanesar that was the court of Harsh. And there's some very nice, expensive articles that come out of the excavation. And then you have to say, well, maybe, certainly at the court they were not poor. They had quite a lot of wealth and so on. Now, all of this is argumentation which is trying to give you some clues that you can use as evidence. And when you have convincing clues that you can actually rely on, then you call it evidence. So there's a difference between a source, which is simply what is giving you the story, and evidence which is has been tested for reliability, and therefore is of a different nature altogether.
How do you factor in oral narratives or oral histories, and I say this in quotes, or songs?
Yeah, well, this is something that bothered us all enormously. Oral history. I remember when I went as a student to the School of Oriental and African Studies in the 1950s, it was said, Africa, unfortunately, there has no history, because its entire tradition is an oral tradition. And we would say, but you know, does that just wipe out centuries of memory? No, there's no way of testing an oral tradition. But then what happened in the last 70, 80 years? They've been working frantically on oral traditions and have worked out a methodology. And this is where I think it's terribly important, even when I was talking about sources and evidence, I would like to emphasize the fact that we today use a historical method, and that methodology is absolutely crucial. This is the difference that I have with non-historians who come along and say, oh, but history is the same thing all over again. I mean, why should you differ? And with somebody else, it's the same story. And I say, no, the methodology is different. You have to use methodology. Now, the methodology for looking at oral traditions is a very carefully worked out, meticulous methodology that was used not only on Bantu traditions in Africa, which raised to the surface a whole lot of history that had been not talked about earlier, and the Eastern European epics, for example. Then it got used also with Homer. And occasionally there are some scholars who've tried to use it with the Mahabharata as well, with interesting results. That is, how do you distinguish between the oral tradition and the written tradition? When is the oral tradition written? And how do you analyze the oral tradition? And that's the important thing. And we could use it very effectively, for example, in medieval period ethics, in the epics, in the regional languages, where some of them are still part of an oral tradition. Some, of course, were written in Janavali and so on. But that's the kind of literature that's now being brought into history, using these methods of analysis.
But again, I'm thinking about, in fact, you talk about Valmiki's Ramayana and the fact that that is privileged as the one authentic Ramayana, as though there is any such thing. And in this, again, it's this question of privileging the written word over the spoken or the sung word, or the fact that of perhaps privileging a certain sort of empirical testing, compare, contrast, see whether the theory lasts out across examples, which then says something like you've got the best version or the truest version of an epic, and these 100 other spoken versions with all their variations are smaller traditions. How does one reconcile that then?
Well, the problem with those of us that work on early India is that we only had the one version, the written version. We don't have the oral version. I mean, there are bits and pieces of the Mahabharata which are strikingly oral in composition, and they use all of what is called the formulaic of the oral tradition. See, and you can virtually swear that this particular segment is from an oral tradition. It's not a written tradition. But you can't say it is because you don't have the evidence to support it. But you can use this comparative technique very much, for example, in the medieval period, where you do have a variety of texts, and you have an oral tradition as well, and you know when it was written down and so on. So it does become very much easier with the later period, as indeed you can use it today. So in fact what one is saying is not that one wants to discard the oral tradition, but one, in privileging that one version, one must always be aware of the fact that there were other versions. And that was the point that I was trying to make, that even with the story of the Ramayana, for example, even in the written texts, there are alternative versions of the story. Now, there's the Valmiki version, there is a Buddhist version in the Dasaratha Jataka, which is very different. And you have a Jain version, which is kind of based on the Valmiki version, because he sets out to say, I wish to correct the version that is current, which has been written by Murkha Kukavi, the foolish and wicked poets. Now, one doesn't know who he's referring to, but I think the reference is fairly clear. He doesn't name any names. Now, even there, within the written tradition, the point that I was trying to make was that you've got diversity. You have a variety. And if you go a little beyond, I mean, in later periods, you have a Hindi version, and you have a Tamil version, and you have a Bengali version, you name it, every language has. Which are not just translations, they are renderings and versions in accordance with what is apposite and useful to the audience that these versions are being written for. And then you go further afield and you have a Javanese version, and you have a Malaysian version where Allah comes in and Muhammad comes in, and the story gets fully elaborated on that basis. So the point is really that when one is doing studies of contrastive forms of a particular narrative, it is very important to concede that there are versions. And one of my battles is with those who keep on saying that we must only look at Valmiki Ramayana and no others. Because my argument is that there are certain narratives that are picked up by societies. Why did the Japanese pick up the Ramayana? What was it that attracted them? So you can't just say, no, it's only the Valmiki version. You have to look at the versions that were current, that were available, and that were appropriated and internalized by different societies and different cultures.
Staying with my championing of opening, for interdisciplinarity really, and the freedom to borrow methodologies in order to study what one may be studying. I'd like you to talk about one object that I loved reading about in the book, and that's the astrolabe. I don't know whether Janvi is here. And she's the founding director of the Museum of Science. I don't know what the official Science Gallery in Bangalore. And there is a substantial part of one chapter where you talk about your despair at the history of science being left out of mainstream history as it was constructed.
To read that chapter.
Yeah. But I wanted you to talk about the astrolabe because the manner in which you write about it, you weave in, you describe it as an instrument that catches the stars, quite literally. But you talk about and make the case that ancient Hindu scriptures are fact and not myth. Close quotes. And the report further states that they, and this is from one of the 14 members, they tried to get responses from as many as they could, was that they want ultimately to shape the national identity to match their religious views. That India is a nation of and for Hindus. In doing so, they're challenging a more multicultural narrative that modern day India is the tapestry born of migrations, invasions, and conversions. That view is rooted in demographic fact. Since the early 90s, really, with state attempts to distort her work, in fact, also to have her name on work that's not hers, or severely redacted work. So this recent news wouldn't have come as any surprise to you. But compared to earlier decades, the current movement seems particularly fraught. And indeed, as Professor Thapar cautions us in the most recent book, Indian Cultures as Heritage, Contemporary Past, that was published last month, and that's going to form the basis of this conversation. And I quote her here, "The link between heritage and history needs careful attention, given that absurd fantasies are often woven about the past by people ranging from tourist guides to major politicians, not to mention the deliberate distortions resorted to for ideological purposes in various ways. It used on panels in different contexts and also in informal conversations over tea and lunch." And I'd like to begin with exactly this, the core concepts of the book that you lay out: civilization, culture, and heritage. What was interesting for me in this book that I'd urge all of you to get a copy of is that you speak of categories such as ecological heritage, tangible and intangible heritage that as art historians we may be familiar with. But you write also about migration, the impact of dominant groups of patrons and consumers on what is constituted as culture, of language, of intersections and absorptions, to make a case for looking beyond the sort of hegemonic, commonly accepted narratives. And several of these lenses are so pertinent today, given the times that we're living in and given the sort of insecurities about all these categories.
So your question, the way I'd like to at some length, we'll be here till midnight. But I'll try and be as brief as I can. For me, heritage is something that is selected. It is not something that is a package that is handed down generation after generation, unopened, assuming that it consists of particular facets of our lives. It is in fact something that is unpacked, repacked all the time. And there's a kind of assumption that this is something that goes back to the past. But by the time you've repacked it over a few generations, you begin to wonder what is there in it that goes back to the past. It may or it may not. So I'm unimpressed when people say, oh, this is our heritage. Because my next question is, what do you mean by this? And how far back are you going? And what do you understand of this heritage? Because your heritage obviously would change. And the source. When you say I'm using this as evidence, then the reader should assume that you have compared it with other sources of the same period like for example in this case where the Narayana Bhatta, who's written the Harshacharita, is talking about life in the villages and the towns and so on. Have you compared it with the same period visitor from China, Yuan Xiang, who also describes towns and villages and so on, and how do they compare? And on the basis of this comparison, can you then draw out a statement which you say is evidence that people in the villages were not always well off, some of them were poor, and we have evidence of this from both these days. Then you may come across an excavation of what was formerly called Harshkatila near Kurukshetra, which is seemingly Khanisar that belonged to the court of Harsh. And there's some very nice, expensive articles that come out of the excavation. And then you have to say, well, maybe, certainly at the court they were not poor. They had quite a lot of wealth and so on. Now, all of this is argumentation which is trying to give you some clues that you can use as evidence. And when you have convincing clues that you can actually rely on, then you call it evidence. So the point is really that when one is doing studies of contrasted forms of a particular narrative, it is very important to concede that there are versions. And one of my battles is with those who keep on saying that we must only look at the Valmiki Ramayana and no others. Because my argument is that there are certain narratives that are picked up by societies. Why did the Japanese pick up the Ramayana? What was it that attracted them? So you can't just say, no, it's only the Valmiki version. You have to look at the versions that were current, that were available, and that were appropriated and internalized by different societies and different cultures.
Staying with my championing of opening, for interdisciplinarity really, and the freedom to borrow methodologies in order to study what one may be studying. I'd like you to talk about one object that I loved reading about in the book, and that's the astrolabe. I don't know whether Janvi is here. And she's the founding director of the Museum of Science. I don't know what the official Science Gallery in Bangalore. And there is a substantial part of one chapter where you talk about your despair at the history of science being left out of mainstream history.
As it was asked to read that chapter.
Yeah. But I wanted you to talk about the astrolabe because the manner in which you write about it, you weave in, you describe it as an instrument that catches the stars, quite literally. But you talk about language, astronomy, astrology, geography, not just territorial, oceanic formulations of space and location, and also Amir Khusro. So I'd just like you to share that because...
Well, the astrolabe is a navigational instrument, first of all. And it's an instrument that is referred to in Mediterranean sources, in Arab sources later on, in Indian sources. It is used extensively. It's a series of circular plates or circular type of plates held together by a pin, which give you the whole map, the cartography of the heavens, where the stars and the constellations and all are located. So that when you're on the ocean, if you point it in the direction of the pole star, you know exactly where, the cornucopia part is, the Cassiopeia part is, where all these different constellations are. And you can then judge where your location is in the middle of this vast expanse of water. So it was very, very crucial to ocean travel. It can also be used up to a point on land, deserts, for example. Now, the interesting thing about the astrolabe is that it catches the attention of a lot of people in the early centuries AD, and every culture writes about it. It's one object which, in a sense, is at the very nub of what one might call world civilization. Because you've got Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Indians, Chinese, you name it. They're all using it, they're all contributing their knowledge towards it. So you have astrolabes which have Latin and Greek inscriptions, and there's some which have inscriptions in Punjabi as well. So it's a coming together of a certain kind of mathematical and astronomical knowledge, which I think is tremendously exciting, because we always think of civilizations as these clearly demarcated blocks that developed quite differently. Each had its own religion, its language, its whatever it was, its inventions, its culture. And you suddenly realize that when you look at these objects, they couldn't have existed but for the fact that everybody was talking to everybody across the globe, the known globe at that time. The conversations were starting in Tunis and they were continuing in Canton via India, Southeast Asia, via Mongolia. So that was important. But the curious thing, and I'm just wondering, I know nothing about the history of science, but I wish somebody who does would take this thing up. These two very interesting features that appealed to me very much was that Amir Khusro is writing his Qawwali's. And he's going all over the place. He's totally unconcerned with the orthodox theory of the sun and the earth and their relationship and how they circle around each other and that kind of thing. And he is referring in some of his writings to the astrolabe. And I thought, wow, that really is something. I mean, here is a man who's a major poet and he's got this very technological interest in an object, which obviously must have been an object that everybody was talking about at that stage. And roughly at the same time, you get the same thing happening in England with a similar kind of person, Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, who's writing in Old English, he's busy writing his Canterbury Tales and, you know, writing stuff that some people approve of and some don't and all the rest of it. He has a 10-year-old or 11-year-old son to whom he talks about the astrolabe. And the son says, I don't understand what you're talking about. So Geoffrey Chaucer sits down and writes a book for his child on what is an astrolabe and how does it function.
And with the way you formulate the thinking of what culture means as patterns of living, perhaps it's time to kind of void it of the value judgment of culture as good and look at it literally, quite literally, as patterns of living, which will include all of this. So this becomes a part of...
This becomes a part of the redefinition of cultures as well. And I think that in a sense, we have defined cultures much too esoterically as the creation of the elite groups. Great as they were, exciting as they were, intellectually and aesthetically and all the rest of it, but they are not taking in the whole issue of what about the rest of society, what was their pattern of living. And it brings me back also to this very interesting question that really hasn't received a proper answer as yet. Greek sculpture is very often identified with individual artists. Indian sculpture is generally not. We have very few names of artists, but it's generally regarded as a product of a guild, a craft guild. All right. This raises the question that if a work of art is emerging out of a guild of craftsmen, similarly with Mughal miniatures, before they started giving way to individual painters, there were 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people in an atelier, and they all joined in. If that is the case, then why do we keep on referring to the sculpture? Why do we keep on labeling it by the label of the dynasty rather than by the guild or the craftsman that produced it? Who are the creators of this sculpture? It is not the dynasty, and it is not the elite. The elite are the patrons, yes. But if I go to a craftsman and say, make me a beautiful object, am I going to be the author of that object? Or the craftsman that's made it? And I think that this does raise a very interesting question of how we label the objects that we regard as great indicators and pointers of culture.
And unfortunately, I think in very different guises, the idea of the artist or somebody who works with ideas of beauty and things of beauty and as a creator of objects of beauty is somebody who subsumes mostly his. We don't really think of women guilds, though we do know that there were women artists, as somebody who subsumes their ego, and the idea of creation in ancient and medieval India the point wasn't of individual authorship. And in many ways that continues into our thinking of art practice even today, in terms of looking at the artist as a sort of rarefied personality. But before we go on to talking about museums, just to stick with what we were talking about, civilizations, and really much required critique of it, I was very...
These are the conclusions I got. Now, once you start saying that this is my attempt at explaining the past and understanding the past, you will have other people coming and saying, this is my attempt, and their attempt may not be the same as mine. Then you get into the whole question of sources, evidence, reconstruction, logical conclusions, etc., etc. That's where historiography becomes very fundamental. The battles that go on between different kinds of explanations. That is all a legitimate exercise. The trouble starts when people start saying that these texts that come from the past are totally factual. Then you have to say, now wait a minute, what is the evidence? And when you say, what is the evidence, sometimes that argument breaks down.
So you do know that, of course, there are museums that of contemporary art or of what is called craft or vernacular objects. Could there be physical spaces which are inclusive, which allow for multiple narratives to come in? So really the case that you're making for history, to make museums the sort of architectonic sites of that sort of knowledge production, which is not controlled or produced by just one or two voices. I'm not sure how that can happen. But again, working with the idea of information and labels, and I'm going to ask you about something you wrote about, again, information. You have a chapter called Time Before Time. And you wrote something about making chronology a part of museum texts, using Ferdinand Brodel's theory of 3 dimensions of time that are relevant to every historical event. I have several things I want to ask you, not all of them related to museums. I was going to ask you about JNU, 1970-71, where we are today. Suman, do we have time? No, we don't. Well, we'll open it up to questions, and if there's a lag, I'll push my